Yes.
Great.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Sansone. I'm one of the leaders of Resilient Cities, a nonprofit educational organization focused on advocating for greater public and private investment in climate adaptation. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar, Rain to Revenue: How Stormwater Utilities Manage Rain to Fund and Protect Flood-Prone Communities. Well, that's a mouthful. It's a big drink of water right there. And it's an increasingly important topic because of these reasons. One, rainstorms in many areas are increasingly intense and frequent. Two, managing excess stormwater puts greater burdens on municipal property tax budgets. And three, public officials are increasingly sensitive to allocating costs fairly among community members. So that's why Resilient Cities is delighted to have three panelists here among some 140 attendees from Maine to North Carolina to the Virgin Islands and as far west as Nevada and many points in between. Before I turn this over to our moderator, Stuart Mader, part of our Resilient Cities leadership, here are three housekeeping details. You are welcome to take notes, and we will post a recording of this webinar on our website within the next few days. Meanwhile, we will post each panelist's individual presentation on our website immediately following the webinar. And please use the chat function for questions and comments. Two other members of our leadership team, Anne Lockwood and Alan Kratz, will be monitoring the chat. Another member, Stuart Mader, is moderating our forum. And now I'm happy to hand over the program to Stuart. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks to Anne and Alan as well. It's great to be here with everybody and with three experts who are going to provide a variety of perspectives on this really important topic. Let's just talk for a minute about the objectives that we want, learning objectives for the webinar today. One, we're going to learn how a stormwater utility can address excess rainwater with dedicated funding to upgrade and maintain sewers. Second, how stormwater utility fees for sewer upgrades are more equitable than funding from general fund property taxes. Why implementing a stormwater utility requires community engagement, involvement from the community, and buy-in. How a stormwater utility can create really important co-benefits, including funding voluntary buyouts in flood-prone areas. And finally, how to build political support for a stormwater utility. This is going to be a really good discussion, and we've queued up our panelists to provide a basic overview, and then we'll follow that with Q&A. I'll lead off with some questions. We've got some questions in hand from our audience, and we'll also be monitoring the chat. And so if you have a question, if you think of something as you're listening to the presenters that you really want to know, please drop it in the chat, and Anne and Alan will pass that over to me, and I will bring up those questions and ask our experts. So we'll start with Dave Cederholm, who's led the city of Concord, New Hampshire in a stormwater feasibility study for that city, and also with a look at stormwater utilities in Maine, Massachusetts, and some other states. From there, we'll move to the capital city of Pennsylvania. Charlotte Katzenmoyer is the CEO of an existing stormwater utility, Capital Region Water, and she'll share her experience there. And then we'll head south to Charlotte, North Carolina, and Mecklenburg County, where Jennifer Roberts served as both the mayor of Charlotte and chaired the county commission that created a stormwater utility that achieved some really important equity-focused co-benefits. And each of our presenters will present for about 7 minutes, and then I'll get a discussion going with the questions. So with some to prime the pump. So let's bring it up and start with Dave. We'll go to Concord, New Hampshire, and hear more from Dave. Dave, you're up.
I'm sorry, just one minute, please. I'm having trouble with little technical difficulties, so I'm just going to try and correct that. I'm sorry about this delay.
That's okay. Once we get the technical difficulties resolved, you'll hear from Dave about work that's ongoing with New Hampshire Stormwater Utility. And I'll just prime the audience with a couple of things to think about. One of the questions that's often heard, and I imagine most of you, or maybe all of you, are aware of the notion of stormwater utilities being referred to as rain taxes. That's often a term that's used. And it's the type of thing that if you're like me, if you consider yourself a policy wonk, it can sometimes be a little bit eyebrow raising when people use shorthand terms that sometimes I think can create the sense that there's a bias against something. So one of the things we'll focus on today is looking at how the revenue that's generated from stormwater utilities creates some significant co-benefits that can reduce the burden on communities. And with that, it looks like we've got Dave's slides up. And are we in good shape now?
Yes, but I can't see you through the Zoom window. So if you can do a verbal prompt, I can forward the slides.
Okay, Dave, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. I appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up from there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you all. This is a wonderful opportunity. Greetings from snowy Concord, New Hampshire. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the city of Concord's effort in studying, establishing a stormwater utility. So next slide, please. As any community with taxation that's where the funding is basically from taxation, Concord's various programs are all competing for the tax dollars, which primarily come from property taxes. And Concord is unusual compared to some other communities. Being the capital of New Hampshire, we have all the state offices here. We also have federal properties and churches and schools. And so actually similar to the community I worked in previously in Durham, New Hampshire, 30% of the properties in Concord are tax exempt, which means they don't contribute to taxes. And therefore all those programs such as stormwater management is not paid for from those tax exempt entities. So next slide, please. And like any other community in New England, we have big stormwater issues. Being that our program is only funded through taxation, it's we don't always get the funding we're looking for to address some of the flooding issues and some of the aging issues. Concord's stormwater system is actually the former sewer drain system left over from before the city did their sewer separation effort in the 1980s. So at that point, we have nice new sewers, but most of the old drains are the old sewer system. And as a result, in some of the low-lying areas, we have serious issues when we get big rainstorms and that old system gets over capacity. So next slide, please. So in 2018, we embarked on a stormwater feasibility study, stormwater utility feasibility study, and formed a committee that included a number of folks from engineering, from the finance department, planning, city manager's office, our public works department or general services, and we had the help of the consultants at Ty and Bond and also Raftellus Financial Consultants. And we worked through 2019 and completed in very early part of 2020. So next slide. So one of the first things we did was look at all of the residential properties in Concord and estimate the average area of the residential properties to come up with an equivalent residential unit or an ERU. And that turned out to be 2,760 square feet. So we were able to then apply that ERU to estimate what the cost would be to fund our program for each property, depending on how much impervious surface that property had. And it turned out that 24% of the impervious cover in Concord is actually associated with tax exempt properties. So move on to the next slide. The next step we did, and I certainly appreciate, I'm sure nobody can really read this slide, but what it is we looked back over a 6-year period and estimated, actually calculated how much exactly the city had spent on all aspects of stormwater management, including funding capital projects. And the average over that 6 years was an annual spending of $925,000. So just under $1 million a year is currently spent on managing stormwater in the city of Concord. Next slide. Then we looked also at, okay, what would the program look like if we were really doing the capital projects that we would like to do? Oftentimes those capital projects get pushed out year after year, and also do the type of management and maintenance of the system that it really demands. And so really the future project would be something more like an annual spending of $1.5 million. And then we looked at the various types of fees that that could be applied, whether it was a flat fee that would be paid per ERU, or a tiered fee for, so larger properties might have a different rate than smaller properties, and so on. Next slide, please. And then so we estimated, based on the ERU, the typical residential family would spend about $25 a year to fund our existing system, and the future program I just talked about would be an annual fee of about $43 for the average residential home. And some of our larger areas, like the big mall, would actually end up spending about $15,000 a year on a fee, and up to $26,000 for the future program. And it would also roll in the capitals, the State House, and the city, which has lots of impervious surface, would also end up paying that fee as well. So next slide. And then we actually looked at some example properties, and this slide really shows the unfairness, I would say, of what some of the property owners are paying today. So here we're looking at a multi-story commercial building, and they actually have a small impervious surface today of about 5 ERUs. But being a multi-story building, their taxable value is close to $14 million. So what they are actually spending in tax dollars to help fund the current program is about $3,200 a year. And so I'm always entertained when I hear this term rain tax, that stormwater utility is considered a rain tax. No, what these property owners are paying today is a rain tax. Their taxes are funding the current system. And so I think those folks who think that our utility is a rain tax should really take a closer look. And the interesting thing is, with the stormwater utility, instead of spending $3,200 a year, this commercial development would pay $212 a year because they have a small impervious area. So move on to the next slide, please. And this slide really helps to describe, okay, who is paying today, and today, it's probably hard to see the definitions of an NSFR, that's a non-single family resident, which is essentially a residential that is essentially commercial establishment, and then a single family residential. No, I'm sorry, you got multifamily and single families. And so really all of those properties today that are paying taxes are funding the program. Whereas if we pulled in the commercial developments, the tax exempt, it would help share that funding more equitably across the board. So move on to the next slide, please. So our next steps, so we're done with our feasibility study. We actually presented this to the City Council back in March of last year, just before the pandemic lockdown was put in place. This was actually the very last public meeting that the City Council held last year. It was received very well. And they suggested that maybe we hold off on the next step until we get through this pandemic. But our next step will be taking a close look at the technical aspects of creating a stormwater utility. What would that rate structure be? Would it be a level funded program, basically funding our existing program, or would we just, or would we move forward with funding that expanded program? And then, of course, developing a stormwater utility ordinance. We would move into some public outreach and really pull in the key audiences, the stakeholders, and get their input as well as the state. And then we'll be, of course, looking for the city council to give their input as well all along the way. So next slide. So I'd like to acknowledge the Concord City Council for supporting the project. This actually was a CIP project that had been put off for a number of years, and appreciate very much bringing that forward. And to my colleagues, my friends at Time Bond, Emily Sherbo and Cassandra La Rochelle, as well as Adam Yanulis and Jennifer Tavantis from Raftellus Consultants. So I've got my contact information here. If anybody needs to reach out to me with questions after the presentation, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Dave, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I'm eager to ask you some questions, but let's hold those until the end and jump over to Charlotte. We'll go from feasibility to implementation. So Charlotte Katzenmoyer, CEO of Capital Region Water in Harrisburg.
Thank you,
The
Stuart.
floor is yours. Sure.
Happy to join everyone today. I'm going to talk about the community-based approach that we've taken in the city of Harrisburg. Next, please. And this approach is looking at, we're looking at various projects, just a few slides about the visioning that we did with our community leading up to the plan that I'll talk about a little bit later on, as well as the implementation of the stormwater fee. Next, please. So we have green parks, we have green streets. Next, please. Green schools, and lastly, green vacant lots. Next, please. So that just shows how all the different types of capital improvement projects you can do in your community that really has all the co-benefits that I'm sure is going to be talked about with a lot of our speakers today. And there are many studies that US EPA has done to talk about those co-benefits in many communities across the country that have implemented green stormwater infrastructure. So the first project I want to talk about really harkens back to a previous role that I had with the city of Lancaster. And the reason that I want to talk about that is because it really embodies all of many different co-benefits that can be garnered through a green infrastructure, just one green infrastructure project. So this was a very dangerous intersection in the city of Lancaster. Leading into our central business district. And as you can see, there's a merge lane that comes off the street to the north, which is Plum Street. And Walnut Street is the long street in the horizontal direction. It's a very busy street, a commercial corridor that goes right into the downtown. And the building that you see just, the red brick building that you see just to the north of this intersection is Lancaster Brewing Company. You can see row homes to the left there. Those row homes often came to Traffic Commission. As the Director of Public Works in Lancaster, I sat on the Traffic Commission and often heard residents complain about their cars being sideswiped in accidents because of this merge lane, where drivers did not slow down often and look back over their shoulder to try and merge in with the busy traffic that was on Walnut Street. So one of the early projects that we envisioned was looking at how we can reconfigure this intersection. Next, please. And you can see that we added rain gardens on 3 sides of this intersection. We added back-in angle parking for the residents and made that safer for them, so that they're not pulling out into busy traffic or backing into busy traffic to get into a parking spot with more turns than you would if you were doing back-in angle parking. We added a patio outside of Lancaster Brewing Company and got some economic development benefits out of this project. And next, please. And in addition, this project, we did a before and after speed study and realized a 5% reduction in the average speed through this intersection. Next, please. So this is the visioning that we did with the neighborhood as we were embarking on this project. Next, please. And the Lancaster Brewing Company dubbed the project the Beer Garden because they were going to receive some of the benefit of pavement reduction in this reconfiguration by adding an outdoor patio space. And they agreed to take over the future maintenance of that patio space, which is pervious, as well as the rain garden that's in front of it. Next, please. And we were able to capture 1.7 million gallons of stormwater flow in the various BMPs that you see around this intersection. It's a low-lying intersection. It often flooded during heavy rainstorms. So those rain gardens and all the pervious pavement that we added in the back-end angle parking and the patio really helped in alleviating that localized flooding that we realized. Next, please. And this is the patio in use after it was constructed. Next, please. And just showing the pervious pavers that was installed in the patio area. Next, please. The Lancaster Brewing Company actually used one of the raised planters that we had designed as a feature for some urban gardening, and they were actually harvesting some local produce that they used in their restaurant. Next, please. And just another picture of the patio. Next, please. We also decided to incorporate some public education and had an artist that designed a, it looks like a barn silo, but it's actually a rain cistern that captures some of the rainfall from the top of Lancaster Brewing Company. And it's an interactive art piece that has an overflow that allows the rainwater that's captured to go into the planter beds that you saw and help to irrigate the produce that the Lancaster Brewing Company was growing in the raised planters. Next, please. Additional public education, we designed a placemat for the restaurant to use in the part of the public education piece, which was fun for families because their kids could learn more about stormwater and do some games while they were dining in the restaurant. Next, please. So some of the process that I've had the opportunity, or might say misfortune, of implementing two stormwater fees, one in Lancaster and one with the city of Harrisburg. So you can look at the process and kind of put many of the issues that communities deal with into these various buckets. So there are the drivers. I think it's important that each community develop a list of what's driving them towards developing a stormwater fee. It helps to determine what that education needs to look like so that the public understands why do we need a stormwater fee. Defining the stormwater program. As most communities do, they develop a plan, and I'll talk about Harrisburg's in a little bit. Pilot projects, I think, are very important because those early demonstration projects, that Lancaster Brewing Company, we received multiple grants to develop that project, but it really helped the community see what the stormwater fee was going to pay for. So those pilot projects are very important. And we've done a lot of them throughout the city so that each neighborhood can really see the benefit of that stormwater fee. A stormwater fee, the planning, the actually looking at how that funding is going to serve the community and how much that stormwater fee needs to be, and the public engagement. I'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. Next, please. So again, two things that I'm going to highlight here is I'm going to talk about why a stormwater fee is more equitable. And next, please. And I'll also talk about the public engagement piece. Next, please. So in Lancaster, I think it's really important to brand your community outreach. In Lancaster, we dubbed it Save It, Your Water, Your Money, Your City. Next, please. And in Harrisburg, next, please, we dubbed it City Beautiful H2O. This harkens back to early in Harrisburg's history, when they started realizing how polluted their local waterway, the Susquehanna River, had become because of the combined sewer system that exists in Harrisburg. So they had a program called City Beautiful, which looked at developing the riverfront into a beautiful park along the riverfront, along with lots of other parks throughout the city. So we took that City Beautiful program moniker and dubbed it City Beautiful H2O. Next, please. Again, another piece to the public education in Harrisburg, our GIS group developed this interactive map. So you can actually go in to this and type in either your address or your parcel number, if you know that from your tax bill. And you can find your property, and it will show you, next please, it will show you how much your stormwater fee is. So that's very helpful. It also helps with the optics because you can look at what other properties, how much stormwater fee they might be paying. So you can view any parcel. It's not just your own that you can view. So for Harrisburg, as well as I had seen in Lancaster, the financial burden for the wastewater program, both communities were combined sewer communities. We saw the financial burden because of the high poverty level in both communities. So you can see that Harrisburg, about a third of the households are above the federal poverty limit. Really looking at a more equitable solution to funding the large wastewater capital improvements that we had over the next 20 to 30 years was very important for us. Next, please. So why a stormwater fee? You can read all of these yourself, but two that I want to really highlight on, next please, is why a stormwater fee based on impervious area better correlates to the stormwater runoff. Next please. And a stormwater fee program also incentivizes property owners to implement stormwater practices on their property, because many stormwater programs have a credit system built into them to incentivize property owners to manage their own stormwater. It's much more cost effective for a property owner to put BMPs on their property rather than large capital projects like I discussed earlier. So it's important to incentivize them. Next, please. So there are over 1,800 stormwater programs around the country. If you haven't looked at the Western Kentucky University stormwater utility survey. They do it, I believe, every year, if not every 2 years. But it's a really good resource to look at if you're interested in learning more about stormwater fees. Next, please. So in terms of fee distribution, it's really important to look at why a stormwater fee is more equitable. You saw in the previous presentation, one approach to looking at the equitability. In Harrisburg, we looked at it in this way. On the left is how much each type of property owner would pay in total based on a wastewater flow. So there's about 48% of the impervious area in Harrisburg is residential, and about 52% is non-residential. Based on wastewater flow alone, again, which has nothing to do with how much stormwater is being generated off that property, the residential properties would pay about $2.5 million of the total revenue that's needed to sustain the program. Whereas on the right pie chart, you see based on the stormwater fee, there's about 77% of the impervious area that is in the non-residential category. So the residential property owners would pay about $1.3 million less of that revenue coming in to the program with a stormwater fee. Next, please. Another way that we looked at it, and you can just go ahead and click through one more time. Next, please. You can see in Lancaster, we looked at it. I'm sorry, can you back up one? For some reason, this is not coming through. Can you just click once and see? Yeah, sorry, my graph is not coming up. But so I'll just explain that in Lancaster, we looked at the fact that based on we looked at it in terms of for a property tax, a typical residential customer would be paying 2.5 times more than they would if they were paying it based on a stormwater fee. And for average commercial customer, they would be paying their fair share, or about, about 10 times more. No, not 10 times more, about 4 times more based on a stormwater fee than a sewer charge, and almost equal for a commercial property. Next, please. So some of the elements of a successful process that I look for: most communities in a stormwater fee will have an assessment. So the property owner needs to understand how much is their fee going to be. So it's important that something go out to the property owner ahead of it just appearing on their bill, whether that's a sewer or water bill or a separate stormwater bill. So we sent out assessments, letters of assessment, that explained the purpose of the stormwater fee, what their amount of impervious area, and ours is based on a tiered system, so what tier they fall into. It explains an appeal process. If they feel that we miscalculated the tier that they're in or the amount of impervious area that they have, they can appeal the process. And then the credit system that I talked about earlier, to basically incentivize property owners to capture stormwater and manage it on their property. In both Lancaster and Harrisburg, they can get up to a 50% credit towards the stormwater fee, because all of those other capital projects, other administrative parts of the program, they still need to contribute to, so they can't reduce their fee to zero, but they can get up to a 50% credit. Next, please. In both Lancaster and Harrisburg, we engaged a targeted stakeholder early. We had a task force that was engaged very early on, before we even started talking, actually during the planning process, before we even started talking about a stormwater fee. And it's important, I believe, to engage as many different types of stakeholders as you can throughout the process. They often help you think through various issues that the community is going to raise. Plus, they can hopefully be your cheerleaders and help explain the process as you roll out the stormwater fee. Next, please. And that's all I have. I'll answer any questions later on when we open it up for Q&A. Thank you.
Charlotte, thanks so much. That was fantastic. And I've got a number of questions I'm going to want to bring up, but let's jump over to Jennifer and head to Charlotte.
Super,
Charlotte,
thanks.
North Carolina, that is.
That's right. I know too many Charlottes, right? I will be quick because I know that we've got some good questions into discussion and there's been a lot of material presented here. So I'm really speaking about it from the position of an elected official. And what you've heard about community engagement is so important because that's how we keep our residents from getting angry at us. The elected officials are always the buffer for the staff. And the more that we understand, the more we can help explain to the residents as well. And so there have been some great suggestions of community engagement. Absolutely. I want to also give a quick thanks. There's my email. I'm with Eco America, and we are working all the time on public support and political will for climate solutions. And one of the reasons we have things that are needed like flood buyouts is because of climate change. And what we're seeing is more extreme rainstorms, more extreme weather. And a lot of communities are having to look at things they didn't have to look at 30 years ago. But the other thanks I want to give is to Tim Troutman with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, who sent me some of this. And we have a graduate student who's listening right now, Shane Sweeney. I wanted to give a shout out to him from UNC. And one thing that does help with engagement, working with your local university, I find that is tremendously helpful. We actually in Charlotte have a whole urban information center at UNC Charlotte as well. So anyway, thanks to those folks. Next slide. Can you get the next slide up? Well, I'll start talking about it anyway. So the flood buyout program is one of those co-benefits that we talked about come from stormwater fees. And we actually in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, one of the first ones to begin a local buyout program. The federal program's been around for a while, but ours started in 1999, and it is administered by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater. It used a scoring system. Do we have the next slide? No. It used a scoring system. Got technical difficulties? All right, I'll just keep talking. I'll just keep talking. Use a scoring system to determine the most at-risk properties. And the risk reduction plan had to be approved by the Board of County Commissioners. And I was on the county commission at the time. And what really helped was to see what our staff did was spell out the expenses that we were already undertaking because of flooding. And so we had the dual problem in Charlotte. We're one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And so we had the dual problem of developing really rapidly and having climate change impacts and having these hurricanes. And we often get the tail end of the hurricane where it sits for 5 days and rains like crazy. And so with the combination of those two things, we started seeing areas along streams that were flooding that had never flooded before. We're not on the ocean. We're not on a major river. It doesn't go right through the city. There we go. But we have seen increased need for flood buyouts. And when, next slide. When we looked at the presentation given to us by Stormwater, they included things like police overtime for redirecting traffic around flooded streets, not to mention insurance costs, not to mention we actually had a couple people die in flooding. We had a lot of displacement, a lot of Red Cross, a lot of volunteers time, taking over school gyms for some of the people who couldn't go back home while we waited for the waters to recede. You know, all of these things were part of the cost. And when they showed the elected officials, here's what the cost is right now. And here's what it's going to be if we buy these properties out and restore them, as you can see on the right-hand picture, restore them to a green space that can absorb the water. We put in the swales and the meander so that that water can be absorbed. We put a greenway in. The other, you can see on the left, the apartments, when they flooded, they did this several times before we actually were able to implement the buyout. The reason I also include this slide is in the middle picture, you can see a big piece of equipment tearing down the apartments that kept getting repeatedly flooded. And I'm actually driving the equipment. That's me in the vest. One of the fun things, if you want to get your elected officials on board, let them drive the big equipment when you first start, and they will. I had an 8-year-old son at the time. It was fabulous. So there's actually a real crane operator right next to me. He just stepped out of the picture for a second, so they didn't let me do anything bad. But that is, one thing about, again, helping your elected officials be part of the process and helping them understand. Next slide. It also helps, there are a lot of pictures on our website that show this is what happens in the flooding. And so a lot of property is damaged and lost. You think about your rescue, first responders, police, fire, medic, they are all engaged in this. It's incredibly expensive and traumatic for your community. So to date, our success, 446 buildings in the last 20 years, we've helped 746 families, many, many acres. And then they looked at what losses were avoided once we had torn these buildings down and restored the floodplain to nature and green that could absorb it. And so they estimate that just that one event that we had with one of the hurricanes, tail end of the hurricanes, saved about $10 million. And over 20 years, we've saved more than 30 million. Next slide. And they actually sent me this fabulous slide. This is from Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater, which looks at the amount of money invested in actually buying the properties. Now, luckily, there weren't any $6 million homes in these floodplains. I know that's a problem for some folks on the coast where you have these mansions. We didn't have mansions in these areas. We had apartments and some small single family and some offices. But anyway, this is just a great graph of the cost savings. Again, you show this to an elected official, they're going to vote for it. Next slide. And this is just a chart on the savings that we've had, the amount of invested, the 3-to-1 benefit to cost ratio, and the fact that we are having to use more and more local money as federal programs have had to go to more parts of the country. Next slide. So again, it's very helpful to use pictures to show people this is the real trauma that happens when you have this flooding. Next slide. This next one just shows again how there's less federal money available, but luckily with a good active stormwater program, you can save up enough. It's actually a real rainy day fund to help continue to buy properties out. Next slide. And so, there's just a couple different programs that Charlotte has used. The quick buy is we have the rainy day fund so that if there's an unanticipated disaster, we can move quickly. And before they repair and replace walls and boards and things that have been damaged beyond what they really should be continue to repair, before they do that, we actually say, look, if you're willing to move, we're going to buy your property. And, they're sitting looking at 6 feet of water in their house. They're like, great, somebody wants to buy this. And as you heard before, you can restore it to a park, greenway. There's so many great uses of the properties that have been bought out. Next slide. And so you can see, over time, when initially started the program, we had quite a few acquisitions and we've been able to monitor. Luckily, the flooding events are not every year, but they are more and more frequent with climate change. The next couple of slides, next one. This is just a map of some of the areas that we've bought properties. The next slide shows that now we're actually seeing this across North Carolina. And yes, along major rivers and the coast, but also inland, because climate change is bringing those storms where we haven't seen them before. Next slide. This is just an overview of other state and local buyout programs. My slides will be available. There are 19 local programs. And one of the things we saw, and it's not just the last 4 years, this has been a trend over time, is that the federal government, first of all, there's always a match required, but their idea is to not have you dependent on them forever. We've seen this in many different programs, local grants, et cetera. And so we got the federal funding to start it, but then we figured out a way to fund it locally. Next slide. And this just shows that there have been, we were one of the first 21 years ago, and now it's happening all over. The next slide. This is not for being reproduced. There's a little note there because our graduate student is working on this project right now, which is really, I'm always excited to see people in planning and what they're actually working on. And they looked at the equity of buyouts and the fact that, yes, a lot of people who are low income minorities do live in flood prone areas. And so you can see 23% of the buyouts were areas that had 100% poverty. And so it does, one of the challenges, one of the equity challenges there is that it's harder to relocate those folks because our property values are going up. We're a desirable city. Property values everywhere are going up. And so if somebody is in an affordable residence that's bought out, they could be in an apartment. We worked in Mecklenburg County to try to find alternative housing for them, but it gets harder and harder. And the other thing is that it's hard for low-income folks to access some of the programs because some of it requires paperwork. It requires having the internet, it requires knowing what you can apply for. So public outreach is really important. Work with community leaders and really focus on that equity. My last slide is just a great summary by the graduate student about some of the pluses and minuses of flood buyouts. And again, they can be a challenge to administer. You have to get people on board. All that engagement's incredibly important. We actually have a whole program, Adopt a Stormwater Drain, where you get your company or your logo on the stormwater drain. You're supposed to keep the leaves out of it and help keep it protected so that it works. And also demand is exceeding supply. We know that many more people would love to be bought out than there are actually funds. And so, now they see that they can get, they can get value for their property and not have to keep going through the trauma of being repeatedly flooded. They've been voluntary, but what happens sometimes then is checkerboarding. Some people don't want to move, even though they're getting repeatedly flooded because they have emotional, historic ties. And so, at some point it will have to be mandatory. And then of course, the equity issues. So I went through that really fast to give us some time to have a conversation. But again, thanks for the folks who helped me put the slides together. And I can't emphasize enough to get political support and to use public engagement. We actually have a stormwater citizens advisory board who has helped with some of those issues that Charlotte talked about. And when the rubber meets the road, what is actually going to be the impact to housing, to emergency services, and to regular functions of a city. Okay, I'm done.
Fantastic, Jennifer, thanks so much. That was a really great presentation. I'm going to jump off really quickly with one question for you, which is, when you look at both the equity issues and the fact that there's more demand than there is money for this, I'm going to throw in a third factor, which is the National Flood Insurance Program. I just read a few days ago the Congressional Budget Office put out their outlook on the NFIP, and that rates are going to go up another 18% this year. So one of the questions I'm wondering about is, do you think that this model at the municipal level with cities like Charlotte, is there a future where this becomes something that's a national program that, FEMA, for example, might start to look at this and say, the recurring cost of flood insurance, the recurring cost of rebuilding after this, it would actually be less expensive at a federal level to say, let's coordinate a program and let's put more funding, for instance, into buyouts. What's your view on that? Would that be a good idea? Do you think there's feasibility to that?
Well, it's interesting because when I called my friends, Tim and Dave at Charlotte Mecklenburg Stormwater, they said people call them all the time. They're happy to be called and talk about this program because more and more communities, like I said, are experiencing flooding because of climate change and the way our rivers and the extreme weather is working. And it would be great to have, it already is kind of a federal model just because of communities sharing with each other. Sometimes if the federal government makes it, too full of paperwork that might not be as easy to access. But absolutely, it is becoming more and more a program that's looked at to save costs. We know that emergency services are overburdened. We know that insurance rates are going up. There was an article that the 30-year mortgage may be coming to an end because climate change is changing property values so rapidly. I mean, there are huge implications. So absolutely, and people don't like to call it managed retreat, but that's really a cost-saving, life-saving way to do it. And that is something that we are going to have to continue to deal with. No matter how fast we draw down our carbon emissions, we're going to have more and more flood buyouts that are needed.
That's a great point. And I see an interplay in this. I look at this from the transportation angle. These buyouts and these, you're right, managed retreat can be a tough term for people to hear because it has a bit of a negative narrative. But flipping that around and saying, as people move and communities consolidate in areas that are frankly better for flood resilience, talk to me a little bit about the interplay between the work, the buyout program, and land use planning and transit planning in Charlotte. Is there an information exchange so that for instance, CATS is able to look at this and think about both in the short term things like rerouting, reconfiguring bus service to serve areas where the population is growing more, and also to make sure that they're not thinking about a transit expansion into an area that ultimately is an area that you want to move people out of? Absolutely.
And for those who don't know, Charlotte, CAT stands for Charlotte Area Transit System. Stuart, you're smart. Absolutely. The county, runs the transit system. Actually, the city runs it, but the county helps fund it, and the county collects the revenue. And so we have a unique situation in Charlotte, where Charlotte's about 3/4 of the county. And so the collaboration between transportation, stormwater, land use. Somebody asked about who mows the grass in these areas. They become parks and greenways. So park and recreation takes over maintenance of a lot of those green spaces so that people can access them and use them for greenways, et cetera, when they're not flooded. They also have to do a lot of removing of debris because as they become flood areas that are routing the flood in the right way, they do accumulate debris. But that coordination is absolutely essential. And one of the things that we're looking at is a fixed transit or a flexible bus transit, better. Buses, obviously, you can reroute when streets change. And we've closed off streets, we've connected streets. You have to be very dynamic in a city that's growing with climate, that's changing.
That's great, Jennifer, thank you. I'm going to turn to Dave with a question. Dave, talk to me about, have you thought about in the planning for your stormwater utility, the notion of things like special districts? So for instance, geographically, having special districts focused on areas that are either have more repetitive flood events or have weaker infrastructure, might need more of an intervention relative to other areas in Concord.
That's a great question. We'll be definitely looking at that through our next steps as we proceed with trying to create this utility. Concord is 67 square miles, and a large portion of the city is rural. I completely anticipate making provisions for those parts of the city that are rural and don't discharge to a closed drainage system. And then, of course, some areas that are much more challenged by others because they're low lying or much more prone to flooding, or the infrastructure is just ancient and we just spend a lot of money to fix the problem.
Right. And then another question related to that, you talked about, you're thinking about the various ways you might do this, either a flat fee system or a tiered or proportional. How are you thinking about properties that are currently, exempted from taxes? So religious institutions, private schools, medical facilities. And particularly what I'm interested in there is, I've heard this concern come up about stormwater utilities and funding does that represent, or how do you address the concern that somebody might say, well, is that a slippery slope to, if you do this, well, now you've created precedent for it going back and saying now we can do property taxes on those. How do you handle that question?
Well, I think, well, we're going to play that one by ear. Certainly, we've got a lot of religious institutions, and they all have big parking lots. And very few of them, those parking lots have been around a long time. Very few of them have anything in the way of, stormwater management on site. But those I see as also opportunities to actually spend some of the utility money. An advantage of a fee structure like this is you can focus the dollars to where it's most needed. And some of those religious institutions also have a fair amount of green space. And so we could likely help manage some of our stormwater on those areas where they're currently green today, and we might be able to identify them as places for bioretention systems or something like that. So it's an opportunity for a real good conversation with those folks. And we also recognize that the people that attend those churches are tax-paying residents in the most part. They live in the cities, so everybody's part of this conversation.
That's a great point. And one more on that. Is there any thought, and this is for you and really for all three of you too, is there a thought to tax credits for, or credits on this for properties that are managing stormwater on property already?
Yeah, we'll be updating our stormwater regulations and our site plan regs. And also as part of the stormwater ordinance, we would certainly want to create incentives for property owners to manage the stormwater on their own properties. Somebody that has a very small lot that's right up against the neighbor's building, they don't have much opportunity. But those folks are also generating very little stormwater compared to somebody that's got a large lot and has some green space and has some ability to do that.
So in Charlotte, we have a tiered system to try to not put as much burden on homeowners. And so if you have, up to 3,000 square feet, you're at one level of charge, and then it goes up as you get to the bigger, the big box stores, et cetera. And so anything that they do, if they have, pervious parking lots, or if they have the, trees and the grass, et cetera, that reduces the amount they get charged. But we have not gone to an incentive yet, but I would not put it past being considered in the same way that other environmental concerns, could be considered for incentives. But right now it's just you get less charge.
I would add, Stuart, that often if you look at some of the legal cases that have come out about stormwater fees and the rulings that really make it a fee versus a tax, is that a credit system needs to be built into the system. In order to, property owners need to have the ability to reduce that fee, which is different than they don't have the ability to reduce a tax.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And we're coming up close on time. So I want to ask three relatively quick questions to wrap up. One is getting to that question of fee and tax, and just a quick one on the legislative nitty gritty. What are your thoughts on the notion of lock boxes? So lockboxing this funding to make sure that it stays, it's prescribed for stormwater mitigation, stormwater management, and doesn't get pulled in different directions. Thoughts on that?
I would say that's good. Oftentimes, it helps to show property owners that this. Oftentimes, they worry that it's going to grow, right? That municipalities are going to start putting everything into that box, so that because they can't fund. They can't really raise property taxes to fund some of the other programs that they want. So in Pennsylvania, the stormwater fee legislation that was passed is very prescribed as to what can be paid for by a stormwater fee.
That's great. And I think you bring up a good point there, which is that being able to create a really clear feedback loop that from the funding that's going in to being able to show how that the funding is being used and be able to report back on that. It's not just about the risk of the money being diverted into a general fund or to other things. It's about being able to show here's what's coming in and here's what you're getting out of it. That loop, I think, is really important for the long-term success of this.
We
Two other.
We in
Go ahead.
Charlotte, we absolutely support the lockbox. We have several funds that are enterprise funds, and they operate independently. They don't even come in the general fund at all for the city. You know, North Carolina is an area that has traditional distrust of government, and so that is part of how we do a lot of things. You know, our airport separate fund, stormwater separate fund. Yep.
It's good. It's about accountability. So two last questions, Jennifer. I'm going to send one to you, which is. Have you thought about, or maybe in the future, thinking about the equipment, community engagement question, perhaps creating a list where you can get people on board by signing up to operate the equipment. You get to go do the demo. I think that's.
That would, I tell you, that is a great idea. They'd have to work it out with their insurers.
There'd be a few things in there, right?
Like the operator had to be like 6 feet from me. I mean, it was really, you know, they're worried about liability, but absolutely. I mean, kids, you know, can watch the stuff. In fact, we uncapped a Greenway to do a restoration project, and we had tons of kids out there to watch the big equipment. It was great community engagement.
Yep, and it brings a little bit of an element of whimsy and fun to it because it's you know, you're able to see some action, and yes, it's a building coming down, but it's about something bigger than that. It's about bringing the land back to a use that's going to be less traumatic and more natural. And then one last one, Charlotte, one for you. When you were showing the renderings and talking about the new space created next to the brewery, I couldn't help but think, is there a possible future public-private partnership in capturing the rainwater and brewing a beer? Rainwater.
So there is actually a group of brewers who do that exactly. They use a process that filters rainwater, and I can't, if I find the name of the brewing group, I'll send it to you. But there's actually brewers who tout that's what they do.
That's great. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's again, it's a little bit whimsical, but it's also a little bit practical. You know, rather than having the rainwater flood, why not capture it and turn it into a product, recycle it back into the business.
Right.
Excellent. Well, we're at time. I want to thank the three of you, and I want to turn it back over to Jill to wrap things up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, thank you for all of our panelists, and thanks to all of you who attended our webinar today. We can all benefit from the experience, expertise, and the skills on display this afternoon as we make our communities more resilient to climate change. We are preparing additional webinars, and your names are on our mailing list, and we will keep you posted. Meanwhile, you can go to our website. The link is in the chat. Tomorrow for today's presentations, and next Monday for a video recording of today's webinar. Thanks to everyone. Good night.